in a land where the dust never settles and the wind carries stories older than any map. One act of kindness stirred a storm no one saw coming. It was just past dusk when she found him, half hidden behind the rocks near the edge of her family's field. His clothes were torn, his face hollow from hunger, and his eyes, they carried the weight of battles fought far beyond the horizon. She was barely 17, raised on prayers and silence, taught never to speak to strangers, especially not warriors. But when their eyes met, the world around them seemed to still, and all she saw was a man on the edge of life. She had only one piece of bread, warm, soft, baked that morning by her mother before sunrise. It wasn't much, just enough to quiet her hunger until nightfall. But as she looked at him, trembling and crouched in the cold, she didn't hesitate. No words were exchanged, no names, just the quiet offering of survival between two people who didn't share blood or tribe, but shared something far more powerful: humanity. He took it with shaking hands, nodded once, then disappeared into the brush like smoke fading into twilight. She never expected to see him again. Not him, not anyone like him. Her world was small, wrapped in fences and routines, and warriors did not walk freely in that world. But the West has a way of remembering what the heart does, especially when the mind tries to forget. The next morning, before the sun had fully risen, she stepped outside to feed the animals, and froze. All around her home, in perfect stillness, stood over 50 Apache warriors, unmoving, silent, like statues carved from the land itself. No torches, no threats, just presence, as if the earth itself had risen to protect something sacred. Her father ran for his rifle. Her mother whispered prayers. But she simply stepped forward. And in the front of that solemn circle stood the warrior from the night before, no longer ragged or crouched, but tall and unshaken. He lifted his hand, not in threat, but in gratitude. Behind him, a woman placed a basket at the girl's feet, filled with dried meats, berries, and a blanket hand-woven with symbols of honor. It was not a transaction. It was a declaration. One act of compassion had awakened the soul of a people who never forgot a debt of the heart. From that moment on, she was no longer just a girl from the fields. She became something more, a bridge between stories, a name spoken in tents and fireside circles, in languages she would never learn, but whose meaning she'd feel for the rest of her life. Because in the Old West, where survival was often won by violence, there still existed legends forged by mercy, and hers had only just begun. Her name was Clara May. She had never traveled beyond the dusty borders of her family's homestead, never seen the town's saloon, or felt the thrill of anything wilder than a spring flood. But from the moment the warrior vanished into the brush with her bread, something inside her shifted, like the turning of a page in a book she didn't know she was part of. The land seemed different, the birds quieter. Even her father, a hard man shaped by loss and soil, looked at her that morning as though he sensed something had changed but didn't know how to name it. She said nothing about the man. She didn't have to. The earth already had. The arrival of the warriors should have sparked panic. Any other homestead would have seen rifles raised, horses saddled, men shouting orders. But this moment wasn't born from fear. It was born from reverence. The warriors made no move. They didn't speak, didn't approach. They simply stood, as if waiting for the wind to carry their purpose forward. Clara's father tried to stand between them and the house, but when the warriors stepped forward, the same man who had accepted her bread with shaking hands, he didn't look at the father. He looked only at her. His name was Takoda. It meant friend to everyone, though few had ever dared to test if it was true. Once a feared scout in his tribe, he had been left for dead after a skirmish at the edge of Spanish Ridge. With his tribe scattered and his wounds deep, he had wandered, until her bread gave him the strength to stand again. That bread was more than food. It was life. And in his culture, saving a warrior created a bond that surpassed language, law, even blood. Clara had unknowingly become part of that sacred code. The gift basket was not just a gesture. It was a symbol. Meats smoked over sacred fires, berries picked by the women of the tribe, a blanket bearing the eagle and mountain, symbols of vision and endurance. Clara accepted it with quiet hands, her cheeks flushed with confusion and wonder. Around her, the world watched, holding its breath. This wasn't just kindness being repaid. It was a ceremony, unspoken but deeply understood. She had given without expectation. They had returned with honor. Later that day, when the warriors rode away, the silence they left behind felt like the closing of a sacred book. Clara stood by the fence long after they vanished into the hills, her fingers still wrapped around the edge of the woven blanket. She didn't know what this meant for her future, but the land had shifted, and she could feel it in her bones. Something had been set in motion, and the story she'd lived before would never be enough again. In the language of the West, she had become a name worth remembering. Word spread faster than wind across the dry fields. Within days, neighbors who hadn't visited in years came riding down Clara's road, pretending to check fences or borrow flour, but really there to ask questions. Was it true? They whispered. Did the Indians really come? Did they threaten the house? Did they mark it for burning later? Her father answered with sharp silence. Clara didn't answer at all. The truth was too sacred a hand over gossip. What had happened on their land wasn't a story. It was a moment carved from something older than law. But rumors, like wild horses, don't always run the right direction. By the end of the week, men in town were talking about revenge. They claimed the girl had betrayed her own kind, that she'd signaled something darker by feeding an enemy. At church, the preacher spoke in riddles about Eve and forbidden fruit, about women tempting fate. Clara sat in the back, head bowed, the basket of dried meat still untouched at home. Her mother gripped her hand harder that day. No one dared speak directly to Clara, but the looks were sharp as thorns. It wasn't long before strangers began riding the perimeter of their land, men with rifles across their saddles, looking more for war than justice. Tuckota had warned his people. They knew white men's fear ran deeper than their wells, and the idea of a woman standing beside a warrior was enough to set fire to even the quietest town. So one night, under a moon that glowed like a silver brand in the sky, the tribe returned, not in silence this time, but in defense. They set up camp beyond the ridge, not to intimidate, but to guard. Clara saw them again from her window, and her heart beat like a drum against her ribs. She felt neither fear nor guilt, only something she could not name, something between destiny and defiance. She knew what people said, knew they thought her naive, or bewitched, or worse. But in that moonlight, watching Tuckota and his people form a silent wall between her home and the dark hills beyond, she felt something she hadn't felt in months. Safe. Not because she was protected by rifles, but because she was finally understood. And so, as autumn crept across the land with its dying leaves and crackling frost, Clara found herself between two fires, one lit by the fear of the familiar, the other by the fierce loyalty of the unknown. She didn't yet know which one she'd walk toward, but she knew this much. A piece of bread had changed everything, and stories like that don't end with silence. They ride onward, carried by hoof prints, wind, and the hearts brave enough to follow. As tensions rose, so did the stakes. One evening, a rock was thrown through the family's window, wrapped in cloth and soaked in kerosene. The flame didn't catch, but the message was clear. Not everyone in Dry Creek was content to let kindness go unpunished. Clara's father stood guard on the porch that night, rifle across his knees, eyes locked on the tree-line. Her mother wept quietly in the kitchen, not from fear, but from helplessness. And Clara? She didn't cry. She sat by the broken glass with the blanket from the tribe wrapped around her shoulders, her gaze fixed not on the road, but on the stars. If they were going to make her afraid, they would have to work harder. Tuckota returned at dawn, alone, as the mist still clung to the valley. He didn't speak right away. Instead, he walked to the porch, knelt, and placed a feather at her father's feet, a symbol of peace, but also a silent warning. "We protect what honors life," he finally said. She gave bread. "That is not weakness. That is strength." Clara's father didn't respond. He simply picked up the feather, examined it for a long time, and nodded once. It was the beginning of something fragile but real, respect between two men who lived in different worlds, but shared the same burden, protecting what they loved. The days that followed were heavy with stillness. The air held the tension of a bowstring drawn too tight. Clara began leaving water and food near the edge of their land, not for anyone in particular, but because it felt right. small offerings of peace in a world preparing for war. One morning, she found a pouch of herbs left in return, medicine for fever, wrapped in deerskin and tied with a single braid of black hair. The exchanges were silent but powerful, each one weaving an invisible thread between her and the people the town still called savages. The sheriff eventually came, trailing dust and uncertainty. He wasn't a cruel man, but he was tired, worn thin by a town that wanted answers he couldn't give. "You've got folks rattled, Clara," he said, leaning against the porch rail. "They don't understand what you're doing. And when people don't understand something, they start to hate it." Clara looked him in the eye and answered without flinching, "I'm not trying to be understood. I'm trying to be decent." The sheriff stared at her for a long moment, then tipped his hat and rode away. That night, the wind blew harder than usual, but the house stood tall. And through it all, Dakota remained close, yet distant. He watched from the hills, led scouts through safer paths, and ensured Clara's family was never out of sight. There were no declarations, no dramatic meetings, just presence, steady, unshakable, and quiet. He had once owed her his life. Now, it seemed, he had pledged something deeper, protection not just for her safety, but for the very spirit she carried. Because in a land hardened by blood and betrayal, Clara had done the unthinkable. She had extended mercy. And the West, wild as it was, never forgot a gesture that brave. Winter came early that year. Frost kissed the grass before the harvest was in, and the mountains glowed, white before November's first bell. It was the kind of cold that made cattle restless and men meaner. Food grew scarce, tempers shorter. The town blamed the tribe for every missing hen and broken fence, though none could prove a thing. The truth didn't matter, only the fear. Clara's family found themselves more isolated than ever, cut off not by distance, but by judgment. Still, the fire inside her remained. Every morning, she rose with purpose, and every night, she watched the ridge for the flicker of Dakota's campfire. Then came the snowstorm, the kind that buries everything in silence, where sound is swallowed and time slows. A rider arrived just before dusk, an elder woman from the tribe, her hair long and silver, her eyes sharp with worry. "He is sick," she said. "Dakota. Fever. He does not speak." Clara didn't ask permission. She simply wrapped herself in the blanket he had given, gathered herbs, and followed the woman into the white. Her parents didn't stop her. They knew, as she did, that some debts go beyond logic. The camp was buried beneath pine and snow. Dakota lay still, face pale, breath shallow. Clara knelt beside him, crushed roots in a bowl, and sang a lullaby her mother had once hummed when her brother was dying. For 3 days, she didn't leave his side. She fed him broth, bathed his forehead with melted snow, and whispered stories about her home, her fears, and her dreams, things she had never spoken aloud. On the 4th morning, he opened his eyes. His voice was gravel, but his first word was her name. When she returned home, the town had changed. Word had spread of her journey into the mountains, of her care for the warrior. Some called her mad. Others, braver, called her noble. But no one could look at her the same. She had walked into the unknown and returned not broken, but stronger. And that strength began to shift something, however slightly, in the hearts of those who had only ever known division. The world didn't become kind overnight, but it blinked, hesitated. And that was enough. The storm passed. The valley thawed. And in its place, a fragile new season began. The tribe still stayed distant, but less like exiles, more like neighbors. Clara's home remained quiet but safe. And Dakota, now healed, visited once a week, not always to speak, but simply to sit, to share silence. Because some stories don't need to be retold. They need only to be remembered. And every time they sat together beneath the sky, the West itself seemed to listen. Spring arrived not with flowers, but with slow forgiveness. The snow melted into rivers that ran clearer than anyone remembered, and the fields began to breathe again. Clara worked the land with her mother while her father, once hardened by years of caution, started carving new fence posts with care, not to keep people out, but to define what he now saw as worth protecting. The town still watched, still whispered, but the edges of their scorn had dulled. A few even nodded when they passed Clara on horseback. Not warmly, but no longer with contempt. That was a beginning. The children were the first to truly change. They began wandering toward the ridges where the tribe camped, wide-eyed and curious. At first, the tribe kept their distance, unsure whether this new openness was a trick of the wind or a sign from the ancestors. But Clara stepped in quietly, just as she always had. She taught the children how to greet the elders in the Apache tongue, how to offer gifts of respect, small things like pine cones or polished stones. The tribe, in turn, began to teach them songs, dances, the ways of fire and story. It wasn't official. It wasn't forced. It simply began. Tuckoda watched it all unfold with a quiet pride that never touched his face, but lived in his posture. He had lived through war. He had seen treaties fail, land stolen, and trust betrayed. Yet now, here in this humble patch of earth, one girl's gesture had turned the tide of something greater than history, human nature. And as he stood beside Clara, showing the children how to track the sun with a stick in the dirt, he realized something he never thought he'd feel again. Hope. Not hope for survival. Hope for peace. But not everyone welcomed the change. One evening, smoke rose from the southern side of the valley. An abandoned barn, lit aflame by men who still believed hatred could cleanse what mercy had touched. No one was hurt, but the message was clear: stay in your place. That night, Clara found an arrow lodged in her door. Not from the tribe, but from the town, painted red to mimic blood. Her father held it like it was poison. Clara didn't flinch. She took the arrow, walked to the edge of the field, and planted it upright in the soil. "Let them see we don't hide," she said, and she left it there for all to witness. In the days that followed, more arrows came, not from enemies, but from allies. Dozens. From tribe members, from ranchers, even from strangers passing through who had heard her story. All planted beside hers. A forest of arrows, symbols of defiance, protection, and unity. And though they never said it aloud, everyone knew what they had become. Not weapons, but a wall. Not of wood and wire, but of will. And in the center of that wall stood Clara, wrapped in a woven blanket, her gaze steady as the mountains, and her legacy already blooming in the hearts of those around her. By midsummer, the land bloomed in colors that hadn't been seen in years. It was as if the earth itself had decided to bless what was being born. New trust, new rhythm, new roots. Clara began writing her days in a leather-bound journal, gifted by Tuckoda. "Write it down," he told her, "so those who come after will know it wasn't just a dream." Each entry held moments not just of action, but of feeling. Moments like a child offering their first bow to a warrior, or her mother laughing again after months of silence. Small signs that the world was learning how to feel different. A nearby town sent a letter, official and stiff, offering formal mediation between the homesteaders and the Apache encampment. But neither side wanted outside hands shaping their peace. Clara drafted the reply herself, with words that read like poetry wrapped in steel. "This isn't your fire to tend. We've built this warmth on our own." It was the first time her voice spoke not only for her family or the tribe, but for something larger, a new community, one that didn't need permission to exist. That same week, Tuckoda brought her to a hidden meadow deep in the hills, where the tribe gathered once a year to honor the ancestors. She was the only outsider ever invited. As they sat in the circle, surrounded by drums and smoke and stars, an elder stood and placed a small braid of eagle feathers in her lap. "You carry the spirit of one who sees," the elder said, "not just with your eyes, but with your heart." Claire didn't know what to say, so she simply bowed her head and held the feathers like sacred fire. But even as bonds deepened, shadows lingered. Whispers in town turned into plans. Some still believed the land needed to be cleansed before it belonged to them again. They blamed the tribe for every misfortune, Clara for every change. "She's bewitched," one man spat in the general store. "Fed the enemy and married their cause." But what they didn't understand was that this wasn't a cause, it was a calling. And Clara hadn't just joined a people. She had become a symbol of what could rise when fear was given no soil to root in. The seasons stretched long, and though the threats never disappeared entirely, they began to lose their strength. The community grew, not in size, but in soul. And one afternoon, as Clara sat beneath the old oak behind her house, journal in hand, Takota beside her. She read aloud the first line she'd written months before. A starving man took my bread and gave me the world in return. He smiled, eyes soft with memory. And for a moment, neither of them spoke, because they knew that some stories didn't need to be explained. They just needed to be lived. One breath, one choice, one sacred act at a time. As the heat of summer began to give way to the cool breath of autumn, the land once marked by division now held signs of something sacred. New paths were carved through the hills, ones not made by wagons or cattle, but by footsteps of trust. Clara began leading walks for both settlers and members of the tribe, guiding them through the ridge where she had once stood alone with a blanket in her arms and the eyes of 50 warriors upon her. Now, children from both sides ran freely along the same trail, their laughter echoing where silence had once ruled. One evening, under a sky bleeding amber and gold, Clara and Takata stood at the top of a hill overlooking both the homestead and the tribal encampment. From that height, the two worlds didn't look separate. They looked like one great quilt, stitched together by seasons of hardship, patience, and quiet courage. Takota turned to her, his voice low and steady. "This is what the elders dreamed of," he said. "Not peace made with papers, but peace made with people." Clara nodded, her hand brushing against the journal tied at her waist. "Then we write this dream," she whispered, "until the ink never fades. But with peace comes the test of its roots." One cold morning, a group of riders appeared on the southern trail, strangers from beyond the territory, looking for land to claim and willing to push out whoever stood in their way. They rode with polished saddles and sharp mouths, demanding answers and scoffing at the unity they saw. "A girl and a ghost tribe don't scare us," their leader sneered, his eyes fixed on Clara like she was a symbol of everything he didn't understand. But Takata stood beside her, and so did over 100 others, homesteaders, ranchers, warriors, mothers, and elders. Together, they didn't shout. They simply stood. The standoff didn't end in gunfire. It ended in stillness, in presence, in that ancient language the West still remembered, the one where silence meant power. The strangers, sensing something deeper than rifles, turned back. They hadn't been defeated. They had been undone by something stronger than force. Unity born of lived pain and earned grace. Clara didn't celebrate. She just exhaled, because she knew that every piece, no matter how deep, had to be protected, over and over again. In the days that followed, the community gathered at her home, not for meetings or warnings, but for stories. Around a fire built from cedar and old fence wood, Clara finally spoke her whole truth. About the bread, about the warrior, about the way kindness had stretched its arms wider than fear ever could. And when she finished, no one applauded. They simply sat in stillness, the flames dancing in their eyes, because they had all come to understand that in the Old West, real legends weren't made with bullets. They were made with bread, with courage, and with the kind of love that left a mark on the earth itself. Autumn brought the harvest, and with it, a sense of completion. The crops were generous, the livestock healthy, and the valley rich with color. The people, once strangers, now worked side by side, sharing tools, stories, and laughter. Clara often walked the fields barefoot, feeling the earth she had once feared would bury her, now rising to meet her with every step. She had become part of it, and it had become part of her. She no longer wondered whether her place was in one world or the other. She had learned the truth. When you walk with grace, you belong wherever your feet are planted. The tribe held a feast under the harvest moon, inviting every family in the region. Tables were set beneath the open sky, and for the first time, settlers and Apache broke bread together, not in secret, not in tension, but in full view of the stars. Takota stood beside Clara, not as a warrior needing protection, but as a man who had found a home in forgiveness. When the elders spoke blessings over the meal, they spoke Clara's name as part of their own lineage. Doli, one said, meaning bluebird, symbol of joy after winter. And in that name, Clara felt something unbreakable bloom in her chest. Not long after, Clara's mother fell ill. The sickness came quietly, like fog, but stole strength by the day. The tribe sent healers. The settlers brought herbs. Dakota stayed by Clara's side, offering silence when words were too much. When her mother passed, it was not in fear, but in peace, surrounded by people who had once never spoken the same language, now weeping the same tears. Her burial was marked by prayer songs sung in both English and Apache. Two worlds, one grief, one love. Grief changed Clara, but not in the way it had once threatened to. She didn't retreat. She rose. She began teaching at the new schoolhouse built near the ridge, where children from both bloodlines sat side by side, learning not just letters and numbers, but the stories that shaped the soil beneath their feet. She taught them about Dakota, about the feather her father once held, and about the power of bread in the right hands. They listened, wide-eyed, as if hearing not history, but prophecy. And perhaps they were, because Clara knew the West would never be tame. It would always hold storms and scars. But she had carved something into its wildness that could not be undone, a path. A narrow, winding path made not by conquest, but by compassion. And as long as even one person chose to walk it, the story would live on, etched not in stone or song, but in the quiet courage of a girl who gave away her only bread and gained an entire world in return. As the years stretched forward like shadows at dusk, the land around Clara's homestead grew wiser, older, and softer in its memory. What was once seen as an act of foolishness by many, giving bread to a stranger, had become a parable told from porch to fire pit, from classroom to council. Visitors would arrive from distant territories just to see the ridge where the girl had stood, where warriors once encircled her home like a silent prayer. But Clara never told the story to impress. She told it so others would remember what kindness could cost and what it could awaken. Dakota had become more than a protector. He was now a steward of the land alongside her. Together they cultivated not just soil, but trust. They planted rows of corn and squash where battle lines had once been imagined. They raised sheep, not just for wool, but for peace, offering blankets each winter to both tribe and town. And every year, on the day she first gave him that bread, they hosted a silent meal at sunset. No speeches, no guests of honor. Just food, fire, and silence. To remember. To thank the wind for carrying their story farther than they ever thought it could go. But not all memories rest easy. One evening, a boy in her classroom asked why her story mattered so much. "It's just a piece of bread," he said, without malice, only curiosity. Clara smiled softly, her hands folded over her lap. "Because that bread was everything I had," she replied. And sometimes, the smallest thing given freely can break the largest wall. The room fell still. The boy nodded slowly. And in that moment, a seed of understanding was planted that no textbook could ever match. Clara never married, not in the traditional sense. But the bond between her and Dakota was the kind that required no vow, no paper, no ring. They lived in a house with two languages, two sets of stories, and one heart. When storms came, they weathered them. When sickness visited the valley, they healed not just with herbs, but with presence. People often asked what held them together, and Clara would answer, not blood, not law, just the memory of a gift that kept giving. And those who knew her well understood. Love, when born in sacrifice, does not fade. It roots deep. And so the seasons passed, one after another like pages turning. The West continued to change. Railroads came, towns grew, and borders shifted. But in one quiet valley, the story of a girl, a warrior, and a piece of bread never stopped being told. Not because it was dramatic, or because it ended in glory, but because it reminded everyone that the greatest revolutions begin not with armies, but with a single act of grace, given when no one was watching. In her final years, Clara often sat beneath the same old oak tree where she had once read aloud from her journal. Time had softened her hands, but not her spirit. Children, now grown, brought their own little ones to sit at her feet and listen to the story again. Some knew every word by heart, yet still leaned forward when she reached the part about the blanket, the firelight, the circle of warriors. Because legends are not meant to surprise. They are meant to remind. When Dakota passed, it was on a quiet spring morning, birds singing through the open windows of their home. Clara held his hand until the very end, her thumb tracing the lines of his palm, remembering the day she first saw it shaking with hunger. His funeral was unlike any the valley had seen. Settlers and tribe members came together without instruction, building a fire taller than a man and surrounding it with gifts, bread, feathers, letters. The flames carried his spirit westward, as the people sang in two languages, with one heart. Clara lived on for a few more seasons, each day quieter but no less full. She continued to teach, to write, to walk the land with reverence. And when her final day came, the valley didn't mourn with noise. It mourned with silence. Her body was laid to rest beside Tuckota's beneath the oak tree, the one that had seen so many beginnings. And above them, carved into stone, were not their names, but the words Clara once wrote in her journal. One piece of bread, one warrior, one world. Generations passed, and the land changed again. But the story did not. It was painted on murals, taught in schools, passed in song. Travelers still came to that ridge, to touch the blanket preserved in glass, and to stand where 50 warriors once stood in stillness, not to fight, but to honor a girl's heart. And they left different than they came, quieter, softer, as if they too had tasted the warmth of that long-gone bread. Because in the end, the West didn't remember Clara May for her bravery or defiance. It remembered her for something rarer, her ability to see a starving man not as an enemy, but as someone worth saving. And that is how stories survive storms, by being passed from heart to heart, like bread between strangers. In a time when suspicion ruled the land and silence often meant survival, one young girl chose to act on something much deeper than fear. She chose compassion. Clara didn't set out to change anything that morning. She simply gave her only piece of bread to a man whose eyes spoke more than his lips ever could. Yet in that single gesture, a chain of events was set in motion that would ripple through generations. Her act wasn't heroic because it was grand. It was heroic because it was human. And in the rough pages of Old West history, that kind of quiet heroism is what truly stands out. Clara's story reminds us that kindness is never wasted, even when the world tells you to keep your distance. The West was carved with blades and bullets, yes, but also with hands that built bridges instead of walls. She didn't have an army, a title, or even a plan. What she had was courage to see a warrior not as a threat, but as someone worth saving. And because of that, two worlds that had every reason to hate each other found common ground beneath her front porch. That is the kind of power no rifle can command. It's easy to think our actions are too small to matter. That offering help to a stranger or choosing empathy over judgment won't change the world. But Clara's life proves otherwise. What if your smallest gesture becomes someone else's turning point? What if one moment of generosity opens a door to healing that would have stayed locked for decades? We often wait for the right time to do good, but sometimes the right time is simply now. The choice is quiet, but its echo can be louder than we ever imagine. So the next time you find yourself hesitating, when you see someone in need, someone cast out, someone the world has labeled as other, remember Clara, remember the bread, and ask yourself, what if this is the moment that changes everything? Because the truth is, the world doesn't need more heroes. It needs more hearts like hers, open, fearless, and willing to give without asking what comes back. If this story touched something inside you, let it live on beyond the screen. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss stories that remind us who we are and who we still can be. Leave a comment sharing what part of Clara's journey stayed with you the most. And if you believe that compassion still belongs in our world, drop a like to help this message reach even further. Because just like Clara's bread, this story is meant to be shared.